So any questions from last time? We left off talking about environmental science, right? Talked about that. We talked about environmentalism. There are lots of other things that sort of circulate around the idea of environmentalism. Animal rights is another one. We'll talk more about sustainability. These are all kind of interrelated topics. A lot of times they bring similar types of people together. Some of it's really kind of radical, others are not so radical. There were people who would be protecting old growth forests that they knew were going to be cut down, and they'd take stakes and pound them into the trees so that when the guys with chainsaws came along, it would kind of like, you know, pretty rough stuff. Which, you know, we talked about environmentalism as being sort of an awareness of values, and that may or may not result in action. So sometimes the actions, in my opinion, are a little too much. So.
What, like pounding nails in the trees?
Huh?
Pounding nails in
I
the
think
trees?
so. I mean, you could kill somebody.
True.
Yeah, some people would say, well, yeah, you kill the trees, but everyone draws, kind of, and that, you know, environmentalism is a value thing, so there's not a, you know, we have to decide the rights and the wrongs about that. Okay, so talk more about science today. So we'll talk about sort of the generalities of what people refer to as the scientific method. And then I want to talk a little bit about ecological footprints, and we'll sort of finish up, hopefully, the class at that point. And then that'll be kind of it for chapter 1. Okay. So you guys wanted PowerPoint, so I'm going to do PowerPoints. Okay, so science. I think the important thing for you to see in this definition has to do with, let's see, we have the world truth, learning about the world and understanding our understanding of it. So it's systematic. Okay, so you just don't go out and do whatever you want to do. There's really kind of a long history of scientific investigation, really sort of grew out of philosophy with names like John Locke, Descartes, and the information that has been accumulated has been kind of built on itself. So the more science you do, the more science you have to rely on. Our modern civilization, when you really think of all the things that we depend upon, you know, it's amazing what you take for granted. But it's dependent upon science and technology. The light in this room, the clothes that you're wearing, pretty much everything is built on science. There are a lot of things that come up in society, in the media. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the nitty-gritty of the scientific method. But the science can be beneficial for sorting sort of fact from fiction, what people say about whether it's global warming or evolution or other controversial topics. The last one, a lot of scientists oftentimes forget it, that it must be accessible and understandable to the public. When somebody is doing scientific research, it's extremely specialized. Most people who do a lot of science, you don't need a PhD, but most people who are actively engaged with doing science typically have a PhD. And when you do a PhD, you start off with this gigantic body of knowledge, and you focus on an extremely narrow aspect of that. Incredibly narrow, so that when you talk to people about it, they're like, you study what? You know, so it might be some protein that works in your, functions in your eye, or some molecule that's found in bacteria, and you generally have to justify that to people, because scientists, people tend to think of scientists as sort of being separate from society. You have the image that you've gotten in the media of kind of a white coat and somebody in a lab somewhere, and that's really kind of unfortunate that that image is there. But ultimately, unless you're, you have enough money to do the research on your own, it's being funded by somebody or some organization that's connected to society. So scientists always really have to justify the value of what they're doing to society. Now, some things are directly valuable. So if you're working on a new type of light bulb or a new type of car or something that's directly, or a new medicine. You've heard of the Ebola outbreak in Africa. So the people that are working on a cure or a vaccine, that's directly applicable scientific research. Other people are doing what's called basic research, and that's just research, just sort of letting your imagination run with you and just questioning how the world works, and you don't know if there's going to be any value for it at all. There is a spacecraft that just pulled up alongside a comet. It's from the European Space Agency, and they're going to land a little probe on that comet. And right now we think, well, and they just kind of want to know what comets are made of, what does a comet look like close up. There's no immediate direct benefit to my life or to your lives to know what's happening on that comet that's about to circle the sun, other than, wow, I've never landed on a comet before. What does that look like? So there's just sort of pure curiosity, which might not have any impact. That kind of research is oftentimes the kind of research that gets cut by budgets, because if people are like, hey, we got starving people here, we've got real problems here on Earth, what do we need to be doing that for? But surprisingly, a lot of that work sometimes has unexpected repercussions that actually do help people. There's all kinds of things that came out of our successful goal of getting people to walk on the moon. All kinds of electronics, computer technology, things that came out of that. Of course, you don't know going into it what you're going to find. The other thing that is not really in your book, but I'll talk about it, war tends to be a real impetus and spur for scientific discovery, because people are coming up with novel ways of, fortunately, killing other people using bombs or sensing technology or reconnaissance, and a lot of times that really pushes the boundary. So that is something that the military is responsible for lots of spurring a lot of scientific innovation. Okay, so here are just some examples. People who developed the Chevy Volt, which is a hybrid electric, all the way down to how do you manage habitat by prescribed burns. These are people who are burning forests and they call them controlled burns to manage habitat. If you live in California, in certain areas, your house is at risk of being burnt down by a forest fire. So what's the science behind how often do you burn? So as you can see, science has a wide area, wide swath of activities. Okay, there's the word I was looking for. Science is an incremental approach to the truth. And that word truth, you should probably have that in your notes as physical truth. Physical truth, a truth that's based upon the physical world. What other kind of world could there be if not the physical world? Spiritual world. Oh gosh, hit the nail right. I didn't have to wait for that one. Yeah, I mean, you know, we live in Hickory, North Carolina. There's, I don't know how many churches per square mile, but you know, when people in church talk about truth, they're talking about something else. So we want to distinguish that kind of truth from physical truth, which is truth that's based upon matter and energy. Matter and energy. Observable, at least potentially observable truth. And I'll talk more about that in a little while. Scientists do not simply accept conventional wisdom. There was a fellow in the medieval times, his name was Galen, and he was a person who taught in medical school in the ancient world. And they had a book that basically described the human body. And they taught from that book. Open the book, what's the eye supposed to look like? Well, we'll read about it. How do you treat eye disease? Here's how you treat eye disease. It was all in the book. And then people started questioning, well, why don't we just actually study the human body and see, you know, why do we have to rely on a book? Why can't we actually study what we see there? So that point really gets to that. You don't necessarily accept anything just because it's in a book. In fact, the book that you just bought, or me standing up here, don't believe me if it doesn't make sense. Don't believe if something in your book doesn't make sense. That's not a God-given thing. That's meant to be questioned. If it doesn't make sense to you, if there's not evidence for it, question it. That's kind of what's called critical thinking, which we will also be trying to instill in you in this class. So you make judgments based upon the strength of evidence, facts. Anybody in here like CSI? CSI people? CSI. So CSI, that's all. What's the evidence? Two kinds of science that's outlined there. What's called observational or descriptive science. Let me see if I can give you a quick example of that. Lately, I've been doing a lot of descriptive science. So let's see if we can pull some of that up right away, just so that you see what we're talking about. Did I mention I study birds? Did I say that last time? Yeah, I study egrets. Anybody know what an egret is? Or a heron? Herons? You know what a heron is?
Yeah.
They're these tall birds that got long beaks. Well, we have this new technology. Oops, I spelled that. We have, somebody can track you with your smartphone, right? So if you have that turned on, this is a very powerful GPS unit in it that allows it to triangulate with satellites that are orbiting the Earth, and based upon the difference in the time it takes the signal to get to different satellites, a calculation is done and can pinpoint you on the face of the Earth. When that first came out, me studying these herons, I thought, gosh, we gotta put that technology on birds. So I started talking to people, and as it turns out, there's a company that people have been tracking animals for a long time. Back in the 1940s and 50s, they put these big radios on grizzly bears, and they could go out with antennas and find out where the grizzly bears are, and it took a lot of work. Now, you can actually put a unit on a dragonfly. A dragonfly. And the dragonfly goes around. You know, you see dragonflies all the time, but where do those dragonflies go? They just around the area, or do they go miles away, or what's going on with dragonflies? So it's amazing how good the technology has gotten. Well, we have these things now that we put on birds. They're solar powered. They're GPS, they use the GPS system so I can get locations down to 5 to 10 meter accuracy, which actually, by the way, came from the military because the military needed to be able to pinpoint things on the ground. They made that technology available to the public. Before that, GPS was not nearly as accurate. I was in like half a kilometer, which for me is useless. So we put these devices, they have a GSM, which is the technology that uses cell phone towers. So every day I catch these birds, I put these harnesses on them with these devices, and they tell me where they are. So here's a bird that we caught. Anybody familiar with the peninsula area around Lake Norman? Everybody knows where that is? So this bird was caught in the peninsula area. Let's see. And since the end of June, all these little red dots, you know where Jitan is? Okay. You know where Mainsail Point Drive is? And it's down off of Jitan. We caught the bird. If you click, double click on this right here, the little green square is where it is now, and the red is where we captured it. And that's pretty much everywhere the bird's been since the end of June. Well, we didn't know that, until this technology came out. So for me, like, this is my passion. So when this kind of information came out, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to do this. I mean, I can, spend all night looking at these sorts of things, and oftentimes do. So remember I was talking about specialization, like, why do you do that? But this is purely descriptive. I'm just describing where the bird is going. Okay, so this is observational. I'm just making free-running observations of the places. And this is sort of just very general. A lot of times you start science with general observations. And this is valuable because I know, okay, well, this bird isn't going very far. I mean, you think that bird's boring. Let's look at tiki. Each one of these birds, by the way, has been adopted by a local school, and the kids are following it in class and trying to make predictions about where the birds are going to go and how far did the bird fly that day, and they got them named. They name them after their principal or after the janitor or whatever. So it's a lot of fun because we get to work with teachers. Oops, I don't want to do that. Let's get rid of this guy. Anybody know where the Lakeside Marina is? On Lake Hickory? Who are my Hickory people? Who's from Hickory? You know where the Lakeside Marina is? So this bird basically hasn't left. There's a breeding colony right next to, here's 127, comes along here. And this is everywhere that tiki's been since April. This bird has, like, talk about boring, just not doing anything. And the interesting thing about tiki, if you zoom in, here's the Lakeside Marina. I've got to go to the satellite. Can you guys see this on the? Yeah. Notice when I zoom in, this bird likes hanging out on docks. Here, you can almost outline the docks based upon where the bird is. Okay, so I'm not testing any hypotheses. My basic question is, what's this bird doing? And you can drive down there any day if you can find him. He's usually, yesterday he was right on this dock right here. He likes to hang out around that boat right there, and he's catching fish off of the boat. You can see him, he's got a little transmitter on him. So if you want to drive down to Lakeside Marina, we can take a field trip. So you get a sense of observational science. Does that make sense? Where was I? Okay. So I'm not manipulating anything. Phenomena are observed and measured. I can measure how far the bird's going every day. Astronomy. how many stars do we have in the sky around certain, I mean, how many suns are there, or how many planets? Paleontology, which is considered a historical science. Now that's opposed to what's called hypothesis-driven science. In hypothesis-driven science, you're looking underneath the phenomenon that you're studying and trying to understand the causes. Okay. We talked about the seen and unseen world, right? We did that, put a circle on the board? Yeah, because I remember this table. Most of what's happening, something's going on inside that bird brain, that is determining where it's going to be going. I mean, look at this is just, and it really just so interesting. Here's a perfectly good dock over here. Here's another one. But the bird doesn't go there. It's like that dock is really no different than the other dock right next to it, but it's not spending any time there. What is happening inside the bird that is essentially determining why it doesn't go there? It's clear that it's doing something. There's a pattern there. There's a very clear pattern. Science is all about studying pattern and but what is the underlying factor that determines why the bird is using this dock and not that dock?
Probably food.
Food, that's a hypothesis. What, Justin, right?
No, that wasn't me.
Huh?
That wasn't me.
That wasn't you? Oh, who was it?
Matt.
Matt, sorry. What's another hypothesis? So if it's food, how could I test that?
Seeing how many fish go around that particular docking.
That's
correlation
one
of
way.
ones.
Yeah, I have a scuba license. I could go underneath there. I could see how many fish are there. And I would predict if it was food that I would find more fish around these docks than those docks. And if that was the case, I would be supporting that hypothesis. What if I found just as many fish here as there?
Then there would be something else.
Then I would be falsifying that hypothesis. And you guys are jumping ahead to the terminology I'm just about to start talking about. Okay, so what if food was equal in both places? So then I would be falsifying that hypothesis. What's another explanation?
Maybe there are more people on one dock.
Maybe there are more people here. Is that something I can test?
Yep.
Yeah, I can go there. I can see. Are there more people hanging out? That's another hypothesis. What's another hypothesis?
Boat activity.
Boat activity. I know about these birds that you might not know. They're territorial. So birds don't like to share their docks with other birds. Okay, so maybe this is in another bird's territory, and it doesn't go there because there's another bird there. Could I test that?
Yeah.
Yeah, go there and see. Is there another bird that's using, have they carved up Lakeside Marina into their own little territories? By the way, a colleague of mine is doing the same stuff with house cats. You ever want to, who's got cats? Do you let your cat go outside? Well, that'll be really easy because there'll be one big dock above your house. Some people let their cats go outside, and what Dr. Roland Kays, he's at NC State, does is he's gotten volunteers from all around Raleigh for people who let their cats go outside, and he's got these little harnesses on cats. Isn't that cute? And you can see how large the home range is for house cats. So it's really fun. It's fun stuff. And of course, that has an implication because it's thought that house cats are eating a lot of birds, like little songbirds or mammals, and people are concerned about, oh, I don't have as many birds around my feeder, so are cats the cause of that? So there's the observational stuff, but now there's the underlying questions. What's driving the system? What's the unseen? Is this bird, there's something going on inside of its head. That's what one of the things that fascinates me about them is I want to learn what it's like to be a bird. I'll never be a bird, but I want to, through my research, get a sense. These birds are amazing. We put transmitters on great egrets, which are, well, let me just show you the birds since we're talking about it. See, this is why I don't keep on schedule a lot of times. That's okay. Oh, here's a perfect picture. Okay, so the guy in the back, that's a great blue heron. So those are the ones that we have around here. They're big, and they can actually kill if they poke you in the eye. There was somebody that was actually killed by one. So when I take our students out, because we got students here at LR that are studying them with me, we trap them, and that's a whole other story. So we got forestry helmets and all that kind of stuff. Don't really like I want to make sure. So that's a great blue heron. That's a great egret. They're a little bit smaller. They can hurt you too, but a great egret's small enough that I can hold it like that, and it just so I can get by with not getting killed by one. Usually they're bigger, so they will oftentimes displace these guys. But we put a transmitter on one of those great egrets out at Lake Mattamuskeet last spring in April. And one night in April, there was a strong southern wind, about 35-mile-an-hour wind, and that bird left at 9 o'clock at night and probably went up to about 900 feet and flew all the way to New York City in one night. 60 miles an hour up the coast. So they fly at like 30 miles an hour, so 30 plus 35. It was in the Bronx at dawn, which we were like, wow, and so we started, and another one flew all the way up to Niagara Falls. It nested above Niagara Falls. And one we caught in Kansas flew down to Mexico. Another one went to Cuba, another one went to Colombia. So it's really kind of very cool stuff, and you can see they always seem to migrate at night, which also we didn't really know. So you start wondering, these birds appear to have a map of the entire hemisphere. Could you fly to New York City if you could fly? Would you know how to get up there at night? Probably not. That's pretty amazing. So there's a lot going on. Their brains are like about that big. So now you start asking, what's the minimum amount of gray matter that you need to be able to navigate around the globe? And I think that's kind of cool. So anyhow, that's what keeps me up at night, for good reasons. So that's when you start asking why what's driving the observations that we have, that's when we get into hypothesis driven. Just like you guys just did it spontaneously. I love you guys. This is such a great, or Matt, I love you, Matt. Matt? Maybe there's not enough food. Maybe there's people on that. I mean, that's immediately you started giving me explanations that that's what's going on underneath. Okay. So we test hypotheses. Scientists make observations. So we have the observation, some docs, not other docs, and then you ask the question, well, why is it using that doc and not using the doc right next to it? What's wrong with that doc? So that's real obvious question. So here it is, kind of all in one spot. This is from your textbook. I've tweaked it a little bit because I think that we have to use some language that's a little bit different. So you start with observations. I'm just writing it over just because I'm used to doing that. And another word that we have for observations is facts. Or you can also think of data, numbers. Now numbers in and of themselves are not observations, but all observations at some level or another have to be able to have a number associated with them. What you don't have in your book are what constitutes a fact, what constitutes an observation, what are its principles. And this is really important, particularly when we think back to the slide that we had earlier about scientists being able to distinguish fact from fiction, things that you hear all over the place. facts or observations have three important characteristics. The first is that they are measurable. What does that mean? And if I ask you to define what measurable it is, you can't use the word measurable in your definition.
You mean like weight?
Yeah,
Length?
exactly. So you have to be able to, in order for something to be a fact, you have to be able to associate a meaningful number with it. Okay, so my weight, whatever I weigh, that is a number which represents my weight, or the length of my arm, or things that you normally don't think of as having numbers associated with them, like color. You can still come up with an index, some number that represents that. So this is kind of one of the foundations of what a fact is. They have to be observable. And either directly or indirectly. I can't directly look at a cell and look at, identify a cell. I don't have that capability. But I can use a microscope, so that's an indirect way that I have to observe a cell. I can't look at a water molecule or a cesium atom, but I can take it into the laboratory, subject it to radiation. I get various data bouncing off of that. So I'm indirectly looking at it, even though I'm not directly interacting with it. And the third characteristic of a fact is that it's based in physical reality. And we kind of get back to that spiritual topic before. If you're doing science, you make a concerted and deliberate decision that you are not going to be able to deal with supernatural things. Okay, so you can't deal with God or angels or spirits or anything in that realm. And lots of people think about that. That's not to say that that isn't real. But as a scientist, I have to leave it at the door, because I can't put God in a test tube and have an experiment where God's in one situation and God's, I can't do that. So scientists have to say, I have to leave those sorts of beliefs at the door and only deal with the things that I can measure that I believe have a basis in matter and energy. And that's where things get a little dicey, because sometimes scientists get so engaged with that activity of leaving it at the door, they think that the science that they're doing is showing that there isn't a physical. It's sort of like I start off by assuming I can't bring the supernatural into it, and then I start to think that my science is actually telling me that. No, your science can't touch that. People are like, oh, we found the ark. That's another issue, because, what if we didn't find the ark? Is that going to influence your faith? That's a whole, so you hear new scientific evidence shows, that Jonah was swallowed by a fish. And I'm like, well, you're really kind of mixing apples and oranges there. So, so that's important to know to begin with. I mean, the big tension point, really between science and religion has been evolution has been a really kind of a big one, but we won't get into that right now. We can talk about it later if you want to. So anytime you're dealing with a quiz question or something I'll pose or something that comes up in this class, I'll ask you, is that a fact? And you'll now have a checklist. Is there a number associated with it? Is it measurable? Is it based in physical reality? Did it come from an observation, or is that just sort of an idea that I have? Have I tested that? Have I gone out and actually measured it? You know, you can apply that to, well, gosh, you know, most people who live in Hickory, I think they think so-and-so, and that's really kind of an assumption. Have you asked people in Hickory what they think about such and such? Well, no, I just sort of, that's kind of what I think. Well, I would say that's not a fact. If you haven't actually gone out and collected some numbers on that, oh yeah, I interviewed 100 people, and 80 of them said X, Y, and Z. Okay, now we're talking about fact rather than just my belief in something. Okay, so somebody give me an observation or a fact. What's, just throw something out.
The sky is blue.
The sky is blue. Everyone says that. That's fine. The sky is blue. Is it always blue? Okay, is that, let's go through the checklist. Is that measurable?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you can come up with a numeric index for blueness. Is it observable? Sure. Look at the sky. Does it have a basis in physical reality? Yeah, it's the sky. Okay, that's a physical volume above the earth. We can, so yeah, sky blue. That's an observation. What the next step in science would then be what?
Ask a question.
Ask a question. What question would you ask? Why is the sky blue? Why is the sky blue? Why is this? And I have under here questions. Mundane, what does mundane mean?
Easy. Simple.
Not necessarily easy, but everyday, humdrum, regular. You know, why am I wearing this shirt today? Okay, it's a perfectly valid question. This shirt, I'm wearing this shirt. That's a fact. I can weigh the shirt. I can measure its characteristics. It's a fact. I'm wearing me. I know who I am. Okay, I am wearing this shirt. So that's a fact. Why am I wearing this shirt today? Well, that's really kind of a boring question. You know, you're not going to do earth-shattering science by examining that question. So you can come up with lots of questions, but it's usually the profound ones. Who here's got kids? We have kids? How old are they?
25 and 14.
25 and 14. Okay, so you remember when they just started learning how to talk? So, you know, kids, before they can talk, they explore their world. You know, they'll take some expensive china and they'll put it at the edge of the table. As soon as they can, they're out of their crib, they're mobile, okay, right around 1 year old. They can't really, that's what they sound like, but they're manipulative, so they'll take your expensive china and, wow, it breaks, and then they'll pick something else up and they'll do it over and over and over again, because they're learning about gravity, okay? And their minds are like, I mean, going a mile a minute, you know, just like exploring, touching, tasting, you know. That they'll take an old shoe and shove it in their mouth because they don't know. I mean, they just want to experience. They're processing data. And the first thing that happens, once they sort of have some semblance of language, they start asking questions. Why does that fall over? Why is the sky blue? You know, I mean, they are the original scientists. And we're still, you know, in therapy because we're still asking those questions. We're still trying to figure out those profound questions. Why is the sky blue? Why don't I float off into outer space? Is the Earth, how far, what's the Earth all about? What's, you know, what are those points of light in the sky at night? We're still working on that stuff. The stuff that, you know, a 2 or 3-year-old kid will ask. So, all right, so why is the sky blue? And then comes the next part, the hypothesis. So what's a hypothesis? What did you learn in school before you came here? What does everybody say? Huh?
Because God made it that way.
No, I mean, what
Oh,
is
so
it?
you can answer that
Oh,
question.
okay, yeah. Yeah, that's one answer. Huh?
Talking about the atmosphere.
Yeah, why is the sky blue? I mean, no, so, no, what's a hypothesis?
It's a question.
It answers a question. You know, what they used to teach me was, oh, it's an educated guess, and, you know, just sort of. Hypotheses also have some very important characteristics, okay? So, the first thing is, yes, it's an answer. It's an answer to the question, but it's an explanatory answer. It tells you about the workings of why it is that it works that way. It's an explanation. You know, you can answer a question, yes, is an answer. I mean, you know, did you wake up this morning? Well, yes, I woke up this morning. Why did you wake up this morning? Okay, then you have to say, oh, well, there were some chemicals in my brain, blah, blah, blah. That's an explanation as to why I woke up this morning. Yes and no isn't enough. So that's the first thing that you need to know about a hypothesis. When we talk about hypotheses, we'll also have a checklist of things that we'll go through to determine if that is a hypothesis. Second characteristic of a hypothesis is that it has a lot in common with a fact. Okay, the distinction between a fact and a hypothesis is an inability in ourselves. Okay, I can't see. Who's got their phones with them? Anybody have their phones here? Are they on? Okay. So if you turn your phone on right now and you look, and let me do something simple. I got my little weather report here, and this happens to be Granite Falls, and I hit the radar, and wow, suddenly I'm getting a map on my phone telling me where the clouds are. What has to be, I mean, we take that for granted. What has to be happening between this phone and wherever the weather station is? What's happening there?
Communication.
Something's passing from there to here. I can't see it, but the phone is designed in such a way that it makes sense of that. If we had our eyes attuned to the magnetic spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum that makes these things run, when you get a phone call, you know, you give that to someone like, is there somebody in my phone? Is somebody in there? Something's coming from somewhere. Imagine if our eyes, rather than seeing red, orange, green, and all the colors of the spectrum, what if all we could see were radio waves? What would this room look like? There'd be stuff zinging all around in here. I'd probably be blinded by all of the things that are happening just to make this phone work. Now, if I was an alien, I didn't know how that worked, I would say, well, that's based in physical reality. So hypotheses also have a basis in physical reality. But what's the difference? They're not observable. I can't see it directly. I have to use other means and develop a picture of what's going on in order to say something about it. So, you know, I put the circle on the board last time, and I said, well, maybe this is all reality. The chemical bonds that hold this table together are no less real than the face on my head. They're just as real, okay? But I can't see them. I have to do some pretty tricky stuff to be able to recognize or be able to state that there are bonds here. Now, if I was an alien being that saw chemical bonds and that was just like looking at crystal, then that would be easy. But I'm not, okay? And that's where that line is there. This is the unseeable universe, and that might be the seeable universe. And that barrier is there because of our human limitations. I can't see chemical bonds. That's not my strength. I can hear sounds within this frequency. I can see light within this frequency. Pit vipers, you know what a pit viper is? Rattlesnake, cottonmouth, copperhead, those are pit vipers. You got a little special organ. They hunt at night. They don't need their vision. But they can see heat. Okay? They can see in a different part of the electromagnetic spectrum than I can. So if something is hot, wow, they can look right at it because they hunt warm mammals at night. So they see things differently. Bees can see ultraviolet light. I can't see ultraviolet light. They have a completely different worldview than I do, or that we do. Okay, so their line is, you know, like that because they can see that part, and we can't see that part. Okay, to them, that's not a hypothesis. That's a fact. They could measure that if they were of the measuring type. But bees aren't of the measure. Well, actually, they are. Bees do measure things. When they fly from their hive to flowers, they come back to the hive and they tell the other bees how far it is using little dances and things. Okay, but that's it's not observable. Does that make sense? The fourth characteristic is that a hypothesis, you know, a hypothesis when you first make it, when you first make that statement, you guys did it earlier, you said, that bird's not going to that dock because there aren't any fish there. Okay, that's a, you know, that's your first guess. Okay, so it's a tentative explanation of why the bird's not going there. But then, upon further investigation, you actually want to go out there and test it. Okay, so a hypothesis that is falsifiable. There has to be some information that you would receive from an experiment or a study that would show that explanation to be wrong. Okay, and that was a great example. There aren't as many fish there. That's a really good hypothesis because I can go out and count the number of fish, and one of two things is going to happen. Either there's the same number of fish as the other docks, or there's more fish there. There could be more fish there. There are actually three explanations. There could be more fish where the bird isn't. That doesn't make any sense, at least from that explanation. There could be the same amount, or there could be fewer. Okay, and if in fact if my explanation is that the bird's not going there because there aren't that many fish, and I go out and measure the fish, and there's actually more fish where the bird isn't, I have now falsified that hypothesis. And the nature of the hypothesis is that it's falsifiable. So if you make a statement that can't be falsified, you're not doing science. Some scientists get so wedded to their ideas, they say, well, maybe if there's only fish there on Tuesdays. So they tweak the hypothesis to make it unfalsifiable. And you can't be that way. You can't be wedded to your hypotheses. Either you accept it or you reject it, and you have to be able to say, I was wrong. That's not the explanation. So a hypothesis is a lot more than just an educated guess. It has to have these characteristics. I think one of the most beautiful examples of a hypothesis. So anybody have biology in here? Biology. So you heard about Mendel. You know who Mendel was? Who was Mendel? What did he study?
Was it the? I can't remember now.
Gregor Mendel, 1830s and 40s. Genes, yeah. He was called the father of genetics. Okay, and he saw these patterns of flower color in peas, and he did crosses between peas to test to see what was happening that we couldn't see that was causing those, why were some white and others were purple. And he hypothesized that there were these little unseen things somewhere in the pea that come together and split apart, and when you get combinations of two of these, the flower is white, and when you get a different one and that one, it's going to be purple, and there are two ways of being purple. So he completely came up with an imaginary world that he couldn't see, and then did experiments to show that that's actually what was happening underneath. That's such a, to me, I think one of the most beautiful examples of what a hypothesis is. He was able to describe this part of the world without ever seeing it, just based upon the crosses that he did and the results. And then it got so good that he said, I can tell you what's going to happen when I cross these two, because I know what's going on underneath, and if I'm right, I'm going to get 75% purple and 25% white. And it happened.